those attendees a chance to introduce themselves. Just go ahead and speak up.
Good morning. Harvey Perez, Washington State Department of Health.
Second, the mic isn't live, sorry.
Okay, Mr. Perez, now give a try.
Okay. Harvey Perez, Washington State Department of Health.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Anyone else on the line?
Pat Bedell, Department of Health and Senior Services, Missouri.
Welcome. Is that Pat? I'm sorry?
Yes.
Okay. Pat and Harvey?
Yes.
Anyone else? Okay, so during the upcoming presentation, Harvey and Pat, feel free to ask questions. We understand there's a chat box too, which Allison is monitoring. You can type your questions in there and she will field them, or you can ask them directly by audio, whichever is your preference.
Okay.
Good. Okay, I think we're going to get started with our first presentation then from one of our strategic experts we've asked to join us. Did someone else just join us by phone?
Yes, Robert Breck with Arkansas.
Robert, welcome. Also on the phone is Harvey Perez and Pat. I'm sorry, what is your last name, Pat?
Bedell.
From Missouri. Okay. So ASTHO has made extensive use of Tim Fallon, who has done a number of our strategic maps organization-wide, as well as some additional ones internally, specific to program areas or substantive areas. So we're well familiar with his expertise. He has 25 years experience in organizational effectiveness. His consulting focuses on strategic formulation, leadership effectiveness, aligning organizational systems and structures with strategic requirements and large-scale organizational change. In addition to his consulting responsibilities, he provides strategic leadership to TSI Consulting Partners, Inc. in his role as president. And I think above and beyond, you'll find him just a very engaging fellow who loves his work, and that really comes across. As I said, bear in mind we are planning, if you all want to go in that direction, to develop a strategic map for this group. So that kind of sets us off here to get started, I think. Thanks. Let's welcome back.
So thank you all. I want to start with a comment about you. So I very much enjoyed the opportunity last night at dinner and again this morning to hear people talking about challenges that they face in the state. And one of the things that I just want to say about that is that I was very aware, and you have to understand our client base is very diverse, so it includes significant corporate clients and a number of other sectors as well as public health. It was remarkable to me to hear all of your concerns about, and you know, they're legion, but to hear them all in the context of a very deep mission understanding about what you're really about in public health. And so I think the mission, I'm going to say a little bit about this later, but I think the mission-driven stewardship that you bring to your work is wonderful. And what I hope to do in this presentation is just to give you a few thoughts that might be helpful, because as you well outlined, and I'm not necessarily going to review them, this is not a time for wusses to be in your position. I mean, you're facing, I mean, this could almost be Dickens-like, you know, there's the way in which it's the best of times, but there's a lot of the ways in which it's the worst of times in terms of what you're up against. So with that in mind, I'm going to try and do three things today. The first two are going to be easy because I want to give you a framework for how to think about not just strategic planning, but the broader context of strategic effectiveness. And in that context, I want to show you an example of what Carl mentioned in terms of how we do strategic mapping, and without embarrassing Ed too much, I'm going to use the administration one, I'm going to use the health department one. But I think that'll just give you an example. I don't use it so much to say this is exactly the right map, so much as to say, here here's the way in which the map can be a helpful tool. And then at that point, I'm going to open it for questions because, as you might imagine, I could talk about this for a long time, but I want to do that in a way that's helpful to you. So I'm going to use a technique to surface some questions about halfway in. And what that'll let me do is in the second half of the presentation, adjust what I say around the questions that you raise. I also want to say that that doesn't necessarily mean I'll have the definitive answer to every question, but I think the questions would be helpful guidance. And I think sometimes hearing one another's questions may also be helpful for you. So, this may not surprise you, but we've done quite a bit of work over the last 25 years to identify the difference between organizations that when they develop a plan are really good about implementing it and those that are far less good. And so where I want to begin is with a definition. So we define, and the definition is strategic effectiveness. Sorry, I got a slide ahead. And we define strategic effectiveness in this way: an organization's ability to set the right goals and then to consistently achieve those goals. And I want to put that over again. So set the right goals and consistently achieve them. And I want to put that out there against two of the biggest reasons people are down on strategic planning. By the way, they're not down on it because they don't think people need to be strategic. They're down on it. One reason they're down on it is because they've been through it before, and that the process was either so labor-intensive or burdensome or painful that if they had a choice, they'd take a root canal instead. So bad process, weak outcome is one of the reasons people don't like it. But the second reason might even be more compelling. The reason is that they've been through the process, and whether it was good or bad, whether they loved it or hated it, their big argument is that the document that resulted from that ended up on the shelf and never provided meaningful guidance to the organization. Now, there's other reasons people can not like it, but those are the two that we hear most often. And so the reason for framing strategic effectiveness up front is this. Frankly, if we could do the strategic plan in 5 minutes on the back of a napkin, I'd be fine with that, as long as it provided effective guidance to the organization. Because the payoff comes not just from having the right plan, but from being able to consistently implement the goals of that plan. So here's the first learning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize 5 characteristics that high effectiveness organizations have that differentiate them from low. And this is just a transition into that. This may not surprise you. We found there's almost no relationship between the length of time an organization takes to develop its plan and the likelihood that they'll succeed with implementing it. Almost no relationship. The slight relationship that we have found is this, that if they take too long to develop their plan, it almost ensures they'll get stuck in the planning loop and never get on with it in terms of implementation. Okay, so I've already given away the punchline by advancing the slide too quickly. So what we found is this, that high effectiveness organizations quickly formulate what we describe as a good enough strategic plan. I'm a little embarrassed to give you this data. When we were doing this work 25 years ago, our cycle time on developing a strategic plan for an organization was approximately 4 months. In worst case, 6. Okay? We are now doing complex global organizations in 3 business days. Because what we've found is taking longer doesn't necessarily lead to a better result if your goal is implemented, not just formulated. Catch it? Okay. So the first thing we found was that high effectiveness organizations quickly formulate a good enough strategic plan. Good enough for what? Good enough that we can begin implementation with a clear direction and the aligned intent of the key leaders that need to drive that direction. Once you reach that threshold, more planning does not lead to higher effectiveness. The second thing we found was that high effectiveness organizations move someone's here from Texas, but, you know, you got to find out if the dog will hunt. You know, I mean, the reality of it is it looks really good on paper, but when we move to implement this, will it work? Okay. The third thing we found was that high effectiveness organizations regularly review progress on how they're doing with implementation. Here's what surprised us. We found that low effectiveness organizations do too. No difference necessarily on the frequency of review, but here was the difference. It was the quality of the review. And I don't have a very polite way to describe this, but when low effectiveness organizations review progress, they have a strong tendency to lie about the results they're getting. Now, they wouldn't call it lying, okay? Let's just say it would be substantial result inflation, okay? So they would be in a room like this, and they'd be saying, okay, here's our plan, and here's what we've accomplished against the plan, and it was as though every time somebody went up to bat, they hit a home run. Now, it isn't that there weren't some good things. You know, there was probably some singles, there were some doubles, maybe a triple and an occasional home run, but there were also some strikeouts. Here's what we found by way of contrast. When high-effectiveness organizations review progress, they're brutally honest about what's working and what isn't. And the reason that's important is it sets up the next principle, which is the ability to make real-time adjustments to the strategy. If we inflate our results or don't have honesty about what's working and what isn't, we kill our adaptive capability. Okay? So think of it this way. Whenever you develop a plan, you have to adjust in light of three things. The first reason you have to adjust is because things work. Now, that sounds a little funny. We planned it. It's working. Why do we need to adjust? Well, think of it this way. Maybe because something's working so well, we want to build on the positive momentum of that success, and we want to divert even more resources in support of that winning strategy. But that's not always what you want to do. Other times, when something's working, it reaches the threshold where you can go from investing effort and energy into it to maintenance mode, and you have the opportunity, the wonderful strategic opportunity of diverting resources from that to other things that are strategically important. But in either case, it's an adjustment. Okay? The second reason you have to adjust is that no matter how good we are at planning, some things don't work. Okay? Now, when that happens, though, you've got this tough call. Okay? If when something isn't working, we can be confident that it won't work, then we clearly want to pull our investment of time, effort, finances, whatever, from that and redeploy it, because to continue to invest in something that won't work is to throw good money or good effort or good resource after bad. But here's the tough call. Won't it work, or hasn't it worked yet? Because sometimes you have to maintain a level of resource intensity over time to reach the threshold necessary for success. So, you have to adjust when things work. You have to adjust when things don't work. And the third reason you have to adjust is because the world changes. Now, fortunately, in government and public health, nothing ever changes, so you don't have to. So think of it this way. One of the things that we calibrate in a strategically effectiveness organization is their rate of adaptation. So think of it this way. The faster the rate of change in the external environment, the higher adaptive capability the organization needs. Or let me put it another way. The faster the rate of change in the organization, the shorter the half-life of your brilliant strategy. Okay? So now what I want to do is with these four principles, okay? See, think of it this way. If you start with a good enough plan and don't adjust it, that good enough plan gets worse and worse over time. The key to strategic effectiveness is a good enough plan, quickly implemented, with candor about what's working and what isn't, so that we can make real-time adjustments to make that good enough plan better and better. So here's what we found. that the high effectiveness organizations were not good at just one or two of these principles. They were good at all four, and actually a fifth one that I'm going to get to. And what they were capable of doing was building those four into the graphic that you're seeing to the side here, which we refer to as the strategic effectiveness cycle. So they were able to build strategic effectiveness as a capability of the organization. So they weren't just able to formulate one plan and make it happen. They were able to build that into the ongoing way that the organization worked so that it became a way of life. Okay? Now, I just want to say one other thing about that graphic. If you look at it, what it really is a quality improvement loop on the organization strategy. Okay? So we always have three goals. Set the right goals for the organization, consistently implement those goals, and embed strategic effectiveness as a capability of the organization so they can do that over and over again. Okay? Now there's a fifth principle, but it's not explained by the graphic. What we found was this, that low effectiveness organizations are activity-centric, high effectiveness organizations are result-focused. And we've seen, by the way, quite a shift in that in public health in the last 5 years. But let me describe the difference. When you're dealing with an activity-centric organization, the mentality is we're working hard, so we must be doing well. You can be working hard and not doing well if you're working on the wrong things. Okay? What the high effectiveness organization understands is if we can get to the result in 3 steps instead of 5, we save time, we save effort, we probably save other resources, and maybe the most important thing in a rapidly changing environment is we accelerate our organizational learning. Okay? And as a result of that, we're able to build adaptation into the way in which the organization functions. Okay, now these are on the test, so you got it? Okay. So let me just talk very quickly. I want to do 2 other things, and then I'll open it for questions. So whenever you do strategic planning, and the title of the session was methods and approaches and methods, so I'm going to do a little bit on that. So as you might expect, I review quite a few strategic planning models. Okay, some of them are complex, some of them are simple, some of them are highly jargonized. I don't think that's a verb. Some of them contain lots of jargon, and others of them are plain English. Here's what you need to know. No matter what model you're using, it always comes down to 3 questions. And if you've ever been lost, you know what those 3 questions are. Okay? So when you're lost, the first thing you have to ask is, where am I? So in strategic planning, the first thing you have to do is to say, what's the current situation of the organization? And here's what we found. You can assess the current situation in 2 hours, 2 days, or 2 months, but the results are only incrementally different. So you can vastly truncate the assessment of the current situation and still get a good enough result. Once you're clear on current, you then have to ask the question about what's our long-term future direction. Now, by the way, I also want to say that one of the things we've seen over the period of time, of doing this work is that organizations are shortening the time horizon of their strategic plans. Why? Because the faster the rate of change in the external environment, the more difficult it is to predict the out years. So think of it this way. I'll use one of our clients as an example. Do you know what the length of a product life cycle for Apple is? Apple Computer? 90 days. Okay, so now stop and think about that. If you're working on a 3-year plan at Apple, you're out 12 product life cycles. Okay, now think about the competitive intensity they're up against and how good their predictive validity. Now, they have to look at technology trends out way longer than that. But in terms of specific products, it gets a little dicey if you go up very far. So what we usually do, though, is like to pick a big picture future direction that's out 2 or more, actually ideally 3 strategic periods. So think of it this way. If you're looking at a 3-year strategy, you'd like to have a 10-year horizon. Now, in this day and age, that's a little tough. But you'd still like to be able to have some grasp there. Okay, so first question, where are we now? Second question is, where are we trying to go? Third question is, what's the map for getting from here to there? And what I want to do is just share with you one of the things that we've found quite powerful in helping organizations develop their strategic plan. Carl alluded to it a couple of times, and it's strategic mapping. Now, you can think, and some of you have been through this with us, so, it, by the way, it distracts me if you move your mouth along with mine. So those of you that know this. So here's the thing. You can think of strategic mapping two ways. One way to think of strategic mapping is it's a disciplined process for asking the right questions in the right order and getting to closure in a reasonable cycle time. Okay, one of the ways we use the good enough principle is this, that if you can get a group of, let's say, 25 people who are working on the future direction of a state health department, if you can get them to 85% or 90% agreement, that's good enough. And the incremental cost of time, effort, frustration, and energy of getting from 85 or 90 to 100, as they say at Minute Maid, the juice is not worth the squeeze. And think of it this way: if you're in this continuous improvement notion around the organization's direction, you're going to adjust it by more than 10 or 15% as you get into implementation anyway. So the good enough principle becomes an accelerative way that we get to closure on the right future direction. So the first way to think of strategic mapping is a disciplined process for asking the right questions in the right order. Let me just illustrate that. Until we know why the organization exists, its mission, we can't ask the question, what are the few key priorities that we need to focus on at this point in our history? So why needs to be answered before what? And until we know what are the few key priorities that we need to focus on, it's premature to ask the question how we achieve those. Okay? So mission drives strategy, drives tactic. Now, the other way that I want to look at this is so remember I said there's two ways to look at strategic mapping, a structured process for making decisions, but the other way is a visual display. So what I want to do, and this may be a bit of an eye chart, I want to explain to you, and I'm going to use New York State Health Department as an example. What I want to do is illustrate the way in which we create a graphic shorthand of the strategy, okay? So if you think of the strategic plan, it involves a number of discussions, decisions, directional, and so on. But the other thing about it is, remember the one argument I said up front, what you don't want is a shelf document. And so what we've found is that if you can digest that strategy into a one-page graphic depiction, it serves four purposes, okay? And I'll come back and talk about the purposes in a minute. But what I want to do here is just say that, so a strategic map is actually a structured depiction. So what you're seeing at the top is an oval that we refer to as the central challenge. The central challenge is the focal point of the strategy, and all the efforts of the strategy are devoted to meeting the challenge. And then under that are a number of strategic priorities. We've got research on this. It's never fewer than 3 or more than 6. New York happens to be 4. A strategic priority is one of the few critical things you have to do to meet the challenge. So what New York said when they did this work in 2011 was that their central challenge was to improve the health and well-being of New Yorkers with outcome-based, cost-effective strategies. Now, this is not unusual for a central challenge to actually have a competing tension put into it, okay? So in this, it's outcome-based on the one hand, but on the other hand is cost-effective strategies. Because the reality of it is that what they were confronting at that point was a need to significantly improve health status and health outcome, but they also knew they were dealing with very finite resources. And maybe this is the time for me to introduce a concept that's very critical. We distinguish a strategic plan from a comprehensive plan. And you're the people who will understand this the most, okay? So a comprehensive plan is all the things we could do. A strategic plan is the few things that we must do. And the reason you need a strategic plan is because, as you well know, resources are always limited. I mean, think of your challenge. Your challenge is how to bring very finite human, financial, and support resources to bear on virtually unlimited health needs in your state. So the only way to do that effectively is to deploy those resources in a strategic way, focused on the most important, highest value opportunities that can get demonstrated return. Okay, so central challenge, improve the health and well-being of New Yorkers with outcome-based, cost-effective strategies. Four priorities relative to that. And this is not a content. I just want to illustrate this. Focus on opportunities to reinvent the Department of Health core functions and improve efficiency. Second one, increase the effectiveness of the statewide health infrastructure. What they were basically saying is the first one has to do with how the department does its work in the best possible way. The second one has to do with recognizing that the State Department of Health cannot be an island. It needs to leverage every resource it can in order to meet that challenge. Think of it this way, the more limited your resources, the more critical your partnership. Third one is optimize resource both acquisition and utilization. How do we do the best job with acquiring resources, but even more important than that, how do we make sure, or as important as that, how do we make sure that we're utilizing them in the best possible way? And then the fourth one has to do with the organization, which has become a model performance-based organization. Now, I'm not going to go into too much depth. I could change the view here, and it will quickly become an eye chart. But they also have some cross-cutting priorities at the bottom of the map. That's a technical thing. They go at the bottom of the map to show they're foundational to everything else. And they cut across the map from left to right to show they need to be embedded in everything you do. So you probably can't read those. But it's strengthen collaboration and key partnerships is the first one. Eliminate non-essential activities is the second one. And the third one is implement meaningful ways to support employees. That one specifically framed with a critical awareness that the number of people employed by the State Health Department was declining and there were significant constraints on compensation and that there were morale issues as a result that needed to be attended to. And then what you do is under each of these priorities, you build out the few key objectives that need to be created. So what you'll see is, I'm not going to go into those. But here's what I just wanted to illustrate. What a strategic map does is graphically depict the strategy on a single page. And there's four reasons that's helpful. The first reason that it's helpful is it forces the group in the room doing the planning to come to clarity of meaning and strong agreement on what's most important. If we could put whatever we want into a multi-page, what we refer to as a thick and heavy strategic plan, we don't have to wrestle with the tough choices. And the odds are that plan will be more comprehensive than strategic. More all the things we could do than the few things we must do. The second benefit of the plan is almost never do we have in the room developing the plan all the people that need to understand the plan to be able to implement it effectively. So the second value is this map becomes a very powerful tool for communicating the map internally and externally with key stakeholders. So internally because employees within the department need to understand it, but externally because external partners, whether those are funders or collaborators, need to be able to grasp this. And they may not need to be able to grasp the whole thing, but they need to be able to click into the parts of the strategy where there's meaningful efforts to work together. So a tool for agreement, a tool for communication. The third benefit of it is it's a guide to implementation. Because it's one page and visual, you can keep it top of mind, and it can, and it becomes a point of, it becomes like a true north to keep in mind as you move forward. The fourth reason it's helpful is because it's graphic, it can be easily revised and updated in light of what you achieve, where you run into problems, and how conditions change. Okay? Think of it this way. The assumptions you have when you develop the plan will not hold through the whole period of implementing the plan. The question is how you adjust when things change. I'll just give you a simple example. We have a client in Northern California that's a regional bank. So in 2010, November, we had their board of directors and their senior executive management develop the strategic map for the next 3 years. Our first review was April of 2011, 5 months later. I don't know if you can set back your clock, but if you think of what happened in banking between November of 2010 and April of 2011, let's just say there's been a few things change. Such as they had to recalibrate their whole, they were big in housing, mortgages, home loans, and they had to recalibrate their whole portfolio. They had to decide whether they were going to take TARP funds to stay solvent. They had to determine what they were going to do with their loan reserves. That had impact on dividends and all that. So here's the interesting thing. With the board and the senior executive management 5 months later using this graphic tool, they were able to make the adjustments that they needed to make to the strategy, recognizing all the interconnections in about 45 minutes. Now, I don't want to oversell this. You will understand the other side of it. They probably gave the chief financial officer of the bank about a 60-day Excedrin headache to figure out how to work the numbers relative to that. But at least they were able to agree on the guidance for what they were going to do. Okay? So the four things are a guide to agreement, a tool to help get strong agreement, a tool for communication, a guide to keep top of mind through implementation, and a tool to facilitate adjustment. Now, what I want to do is, now I want to go to questions. Okay? So I could go on for the rest of the time, but I also think that the more responsive this is to you, the more helpful, and then so I want to adjust. But I'm going to use a technique. I don't know if some of you are even too young to remember this, but when Charles de Gaulle used to do a press conference, he had a very unique way he did it. He took all the questions up front. And of course, being a politician, then he only answered the ones he wanted to. But what I'm going to do is, rather than go question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, I'm going to just get a sampling of maybe 6 or 8 or 10 questions. And what that'll let me do is, in answering those, frame some remarks for the rest of the time that we have. Okay? So let me open it up. I'm going to write these down. Allison, I think you've got, or there's mics available, or Allison can bring you one. So the other thing I find with this, by the way, is it's always hard to ask the first question. So we're not going to have a first question. We'll go right to the second one. And people on the phone, please feel free. There's one in the back.
Thank you. Tim, I like your diagram here a lot, and obviously this is a high-level view, yes. So could you at some point speak on where do we start talking about measurable goals, dates, and so forth? I don't see that on this, but maybe it's going to be high-level.
Great question. I'll be glad to do that. Thank you.
And I just want to give a moment for the additional folks on the phone to introduce themselves who have joined us. I see a couple others have joined. On the phone? You're not on mute. I've done that before.
This is Donna Moore from Wisconsin.
Anyone else? All right, thanks. And remember, you can feel free to voice your question or type it into the chat box, and I'll field it for you. Is there any sort of what the right size group is to initially develop your strategic priorities? Like who should be really in the room when you have a larger organization and you want buy-in, but sometimes too many cooks can spoil the pot?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
And I think somewhere between those two questions is what's the implementation group look like then? that there's a planning group, but then there's a kind of how you get the things
Yep.
done that you put on that page.
Yep.
And it's hard to read, and you didn't intend it for us, but what are the kinds of things that ended up underneath those?
Oh, you want me to just give you, I can give you a couple of
Just
examples.
when you're going through, yeah, just
I
so
will
we can
then.
get a sense.
Okay. Great questions.
Can you explain how you maintain accountability and hold people to it?
Great question, thanks. Anything else? Well, let's do this. I'll take a shot at those, and people may want to ask some follow-ups. I'm going to do it in this order. Okay, I'm going to just give a couple of illustrations of examples, which was like almost the last question, but especially probably the only people that can read this is if they're linked in on the web. They probably have better view of the movie. So I'm going to just illustrate. I'm going to give you a concept, and then I'm going to illustrate it. The key in moving from, the key in setting an organization's direction is going successively down through levels of detail. So if you think about mission, might be the same for 20 years. So mission and vision provide the broad direction. They're very helpful in terms of continuity. They're very helpful in terms of meaning, in terms of what's meaningful. They're very poor at giving you the ability to make decisions among competing alternatives. They're just too broad. So more specific than mission and vision is strategy, what we need to do. More specific yet is tactic of how we're going to do it. And since this is a strategic map, it's only describing what, it's not yet describing how, which gets us to all the implementation questions, measurability, and how you deploy groups differently, and so on. So I'll get to that in just a minute. But when an organization has an effective strategy, it's able to go from big picture down to very specific. And it's able to do that differentiated by time frame. Okay, so while this is a 3-year map, when we do implementation, it's against 1-year implementation priorities. And because this is a 3-year map, it's more than we can do in a single year. So one of the key things coming out of strategic planning is to identify the 3 to 5 major thrusts that the organization is going to take in any planned period, and I'll say more about that in a minute. You're asking all the right questions. Because think of it this way. We only have limited resources that we can deploy to this. So I'm going to just give you an example. So what you're seeing is the central challenge is the highest level in terms of biggest picture. It's biggest picture directional. The strategic priorities get more specific, and then the objectives get more specific yet. They're still not, and that was a really good first question, they're still not to the, if you think of, when I say strategic objective, I distinguish that from what some of you might be used to in terms of SMART objectives, specific, measurable, and so on. So at the strategic map level, we may have measures and we may have indicators, but they're probably not as specific as we're going to need as we actually get into unit and individual kind of goals relative to that. So I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So I'm going to just illustrate to answer your question about, and I have to apologize because I don't have my glasses on, so I have to tip my machine. So strategic priority A, which is focused on opportunities to reinvent the Department of Health core functions and to improve its efficiency. Okay, so the first objective under that is to define the core functions, engaging both internal and external stakeholders. So the sense there was that all the things they were doing now were not necessarily core against the future. And how did they go from the long list of everything we're doing now to the shorter list of the few things that are critical going forward? And then the second one was advocate/implement required changes in modification in statute and regulation. They were actually going to say if there's things that statute or regulation is asking us to do that we no longer think are necessary, we're going to try to change them. So there's a policy dimension in there, but since this is the Department of Health, it obviously would be worked through the Office of the Governor, not taken directly to the legislature, and you get all that, okay? Third one, increase flexibility needed to maximize and leverage available resources. What was really clear here was they felt that the organization and its business processes were what we used to need and were too rigid, And it wasn't that they could throw them out or that they didn't need some of them. See, think of it this way. Every organization faces three challenges, okay? The first challenge that you face is you have to this is, by the way, V. Jacob Indirajan at the Tuck School of Business. This is not me. The first challenge you have is manage the present, okay? You've got to serve today's people, in whatever way. You've got to do a good job with managing the present. The second thing you've got to be able to do is create the future. And the third thing you've got to be able to do is to selectively forget the past. Now, here's the dilemma that most organizations have, is that if you ask for their deployment across those three priorities, it's 99, one-half, one-half. Okay? If 90+% of your energy is going in to manage the present in a rapidly changing environment, that's a problem. Because you're under-deployed against creating the future. Okay? So, hopefully that gives you an idea of how the map starts to fold down. I'm going to now go to what's the size of the planning group. There's two issues there. The first is the right size of the group, and the second is the right people in that group. Okay, so here's a couple of principles. First of all, so we routinely would facilitate groups of approximately 25. Okay? Now, here's the other thing about those 25. You'd like that group of 25 to have two other characteristics. The only reason I said it that way, that we routinely do 25, I think if you were trying to do 25 with internal facilitation, it would be really, really hard. When you come in as an outsider, you do get more, they will give you more latitude about pushing back and getting to closure than they will allow an internal person. I'm just being candid about that. So if you were doing it internally, that's probably more than you want to handle. But we routinely do 25. We did Arkansas, 30+. Okay? So, but here's the other key. The right people, and there's two ways you want to look at that. A microcosm reasonably representative of the health department as a whole, but not necessarily down through all the layers, okay? So it would be horizontally broad in terms of covering all the functions and services, but it wouldn't necessarily be deep in terms of including all the levels. And the third principle would be the key people that need to drive implementation of the plan. It's a real flaw if you're asking me to lead what I didn't help to build. Because what you've got to really get out of the process is two things. Not only the right direction, you've got to get strong ownership of that direction by the key people who, let's be honest with it, are going to need to do this with a very careful deployment of their energy because they had a full plate when they walked in the room. And if we're going to get a shift of what they're doing, they're going to have to be committed enough to make that shift happen. Okay? Now, I'll just give you one other thing that you didn't ask about but might be helpful here, and that is that what we're typically trying to do, we're not trying to shift 100% of what the organization does. We're trying to get a leverage point in shifting 10 to 20% of what the organization does to be truly strategic so that has a ripple effect through the rest of it. Okay? So, but now stop and think about it. These people walk in the room probably already inundated with their day job, and you're going to try and get them to make a 10 to 20% energy shift. If they're not in on that, especially in organizations that have, I'm going to say this politely, limited mechanisms for ensuring accountability, it's an issue. Okay? Now, I think the other thing that I want to do is, now I'm going to do implementation groups, and then I'm going to do from high level down to specificity with measures and accountabilities. I think those are I'm trying to get a logic order here. Okay, so very astute comment. The way you organize to develop the plan is rarely the way you need to organize to implement the plan. It involves the same people plus, but they may be configured differently. Okay, so I'm going to go back and do a slide change because I want to illustrate this. harder to do this when it isn't your machine. Okay, so what I want to do is show you, and Allison, I'll go to the questions on the phone here in just a minute. What I want to do is show you, and if she's changing, I'm back to the original presentation down a ways, so I'm not running the telecom or the webinar she is. Okay, so here's what I want to illustrate. So you develop this strategic map. So you say, okay, this is what the overall organization is doing. Okay. What you then have to do is to say, this is a 3-year map, and we only want to look at year 1. Our typical framework would be a 3-year strategy, 1-year implementation plan. Okay? So the first thing you have to do is to say, of the many things on this map, what are the few that we're going to focus on in the first year? And here's the thing that we found. The biggest single mistake that organizations make when they move to implementation is they try to do too much at once. It's what I refer to as the buffet dilemma. You know, you've got this big plate, all the food looks wonderful, you fill your plate with all the food, but as my mother would say, your eyes were bigger than your stomach. It's more than you can do. So what we found is this, that if an organization focuses its implementation on a few key things, they build a positive momentum of success through accomplishment, and then they can go on to second iteration and third iteration priorities. But think of it this way, if you only have $1 worth of resources, don't spread it out like it's 20 nickels. You've got to focus. Our usual rule of thumb on organizational initiatives in the first year is 3 to 5. Okay? But what you're going to try and do now with that strategic map then is get it down to a limited number of tracks of work that are organizational initiatives. And you're also going to look at that in terms of what that means for program, department, and unit priorities. And at this point now, you're going to take those implementation plans down not to broad concepts, but who does what by when. So those implementation plans now, which are configured multidimensional, organization-wide initiatives, usually involve cross-functional teams, and that may be new work. So that's one of the reasons you only want to do a few of them. Department, unit, and program priorities are the way in which you're asking departments, units, and programs to align with the overall direction. Okay? But at this level now, you're actually asking them to set goals and objectives, and we like to do this in result-based terms, not activities, so that you're actually getting down to who's going to do what by when. A result achieved, an accountable person or group, and a deadline. And it's at this point then that you begin to attach clear indicators, measures, and hopefully if you take an overall look, you build a dashboard for the organization. Okay? And then what you ultimately like to do is get that down so that it gets to individual key results. Now, what I would be very honest with you about is if an organization is used to this, in the first iteration, it may not get that far, but at least it should get to selective key results of your key leaders who need to drive implementation. We refer to this as a line of sight, and you build the line of sight from map to organization-wide initiatives and program department and unit priorities, and then to individual. But what you'd like is for every individual in the organization to be able to say, here's what I do today, and here's the difference it makes to my department or my program, and here's the way it contributes to the department's strategic plan. Okay? So now, here's the other thing we find, though. Even when that's done well, there are a number of factors which relate to whether that system will take at the organization level. And I'm just going to take a highlight here. I'm watching my time, and I want to get to the phone. The biggest single factor in driving successful implementation is leadership will, which results in requiring consistent, aligned, accountable behavior down through programs, units, and so on. Okay? Where that exists, the progress is amazing, when that doesn't exist, there's almost no other factor that you can manage that will be powerful enough to get good results. Okay, now I can say more about that. But Allison, I think you've got some questions that have chimed in either, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. I think I got the questions at least in broad outline. Did I? Do you have additional? I mean, I can go on, but are there other questions you want to ask? Yes, please.
Come up.
Hi. I find out that one of the biggest challenges is actually to assemble the leadership to collaborate on developing a strategic plan, but it's actually the implementation of it, meaning that there can be agreement at a high-level managerial standpoint, and then when there's follow-up, that usually entails activities and actions that take place
down throughout
the organization. And the biggest challenge really is to have everyone down to the person at the local health department, and their specific actions eventually have to align with some of these strategic objectives that are defined. And so could you speak to, from a managerial standpoint, how effectively how to infiltrate their strategies and objectives throughout the organization?
Great question. I'll do the best I can. What I'm going to do is pretty quickly give you a concept, and then I'll answer the question a little more specifically. I want to elaborate on this notion that leadership is the most powerful variable because, I mean, that's sort of of course it is, but I want to basically say that here's what we found is that there's effective implementation requires three kinds of leadership, okay? The first kind of leadership it needs is an executive or sponsoring leader. Now, I want to define that, okay? The executive or sponsoring leader is the person or group that has the go, no-go decision on whether we're going to do this and has the ability to reallocate resources, at least to some extent, because I know that it's not like every resource in the health department is flexible. I mean, you can't basically just say, well, I know they gave us this money for WIC, but we'll do something else with it. I mean, the reality of it is categorical funding is a real issue relative to, I mean, it can be very strategic or not so. But think of it this way. So in your question, I think what you were basically saying, okay, so you get the leadership group together of the department, and let's say it's 8 people or 10 people or whatever that number of people is. Getting them to agree isn't the challenge, okay? It's once they get to that agreement, how do you get it down through the organization? So here's what we find. The executive or sponsoring leader, that person or group who says this is what we're going to do, is necessary but insufficient to get appropriate implementation. The second thing you need is a front-line leader. Think of it this way, at the point of the spear in every place you need to attack. Okay, so it may be that front-line leader is a program director. It may be that it's a department head. It may be that it's, but the reality of it is that every unit of impact, you need a front-line leader who understands how the strategy translates into their area of responsibility and what the expectations are for what they do with their people and their group to make it happen. And this is easier when those units are already organized in that way. It's tougher if this becomes an organization-wide initiative that's cross-functional, because there probably isn't a structure that exists to do that. The third thing we find is that there's a third leadership role. We're seeing this in a number of health departments, for example, being played out by performance management organizations. And we refer to this as the consultative or the supportive leader. Those can be from organizational development, HR, they could be from finance. You might very well play those roles. I'm going to say a word about that in the few minutes I have left. Here's the thing. The consultative or supportive leader does not typically have role-based authority. They're working with their peers, but they're monitoring those peers. So I'm going to describe the way this works in one of the health departments we work with. So the Commissioner of Health is the sponsoring leader, and he's got a senior leadership team of like 6 or 8 people, so they're the sponsoring leader. The person in the performance support role works very closely with the Commissioner of Health. So this is the Director of the Performance Management Office. Her day-by-day job is to monitor all the things that are supposed to be being implemented with the strategy. And when those people need help, she gets them either the coaching or the resource or whatever they need, but she doesn't let it deviate more than 2 degrees before there's remediation. And when necessary, if somebody's off task, she makes clear to the executive leader that there's need for a higher order intervention, or as she probably would say, somebody above my pay grade needs to help.
CFO
okay?
conference.
Now what we find is if you get those 3 leadership dynamics working together in an orchestrated way, and if you put in place regularly review and test opportunities, so people in front of their peers have to report on how they're doing or how they're not, that you start to get the kind of iterations in place that over time gets it down through the organization. But if you have a tooth missing in the smile of leadership here, if you're missing any one of these 3 critical leadership roles, implementation will run into problems. I want to just take a minute to do a closing slide, and then I'll be around if people want to ask some questions. I got to get to the right slide. Okay. I actually have thought about this from your standpoint, and I think you have 3 really significant roles to play from a Chief Financial Officer perspective relative to implementation. Okay? And I really want to go back to what I said at the very beginning. I thought the mission orientation you had about your roles as you were describing it last night was really important. So the key to all 3 of these roles is that you stay mission-driven, which I know is your orientation. Now, don't get me wrong. You've still got to be financially responsible. I'm not suggesting that you don't have to account for it, and all of those things. But we're about more than just keeping track of the dollars and the resources. We're about improving health. So the first thing is, I think you've got a strategist role that you could play at 2 levels. One point is this. It's a dream and not a plan until you calibrate it to resources. So I think one of your very key strategic roles is helping people understand what both the resource opportunities and the resource constraints are. And let's face it, most of you are not going to be in a growing the pie circumstance. You're going to be in a reallocation mode. You're most likely going to be dealing with how you need to become more strategic with your limited resources because they're going to become less available. And the issue is going to be how do we focus them on the highest value results. I'm on it. Okay. Second, you've obviously got a stewardship role. This is not our money, okay? These are not our resources. We've got a health responsibility to the public. We've got a fiduciary responsibility to our stakeholders and so on. And so that stewardship role is absolutely critical. The third one that I want to touch on, though, is I think you can play a very meaningful role as a capacity builder within your organization to, you understand the resource dimensions of what needs to be done strategically better than many of your colleagues, even though they may be very conscientious. And the question is how, over time, you work with them in a consultative, supportive role to help them to build their capacity to understand how to make good judgments about allocating limited resources to the highest value health-producing results. So I've been given the time signal, so I think we're there at time. Jim, did you want to?
I just want to make one last comment, if you let me, Allison. About the capacity builder piece, one thing that we're really interested in understanding from you at ASTHO is, one thing we're really interested in learning from you about at ASTHO is how are you building capacity for fee-for-service in terms of billing, collections, follow-up, guidance for billing, when in fact that's a common activity that might be cutting across a number of programs. I think it's a perfect example of building one capacity in the agency to serve many fee generation needs.
Yes.
So if anybody's got a clever solution there or is working that out, we're very interested in learning about that. So thank you.
I also think the network is a powerful tool for building CFO capacity that then can be leveraged back into the various health departments. If I'd had more time, I could have written you a shorter letter. So thank you very much for your kind attention this morning. I'm going to be around a little while. I know there were probably questions that I didn't get a chance to, so I'll be here for a while. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Please stand by.